have such sights to show you.
We're Poppin the Scary Horror Podcast. I'm your host, Coale, and with me, as always, I have my good friend and co-host, Aaron. Aaron,
Hey.
You keeping all your fingertips attached with how frigid it is out?
So far, yeah. Except for the ones I've burned off to get away with crimes.
Okay, well, let's just make an awkward segue to talk about Dr. Sleep then.
Oh, great.
So we don't incriminate ourselves. Yeah, so today's episode is going to be us watching Dr. Sleep, which is a film that I'm like, oh man, they made a sequel to The Shining in book form, and they adapted it into a movie. I need to check that out. 6 years later, I have still not seen the freaking movie.
Oh, for real? So
Yeah.
this is the first time for both
Yeah,
of us.
yeah, I bought the film like years ago, and I'm like, if I buy it, that means I will watch it. No, that is not the case at all whatsoever. But yeah, and obviously, if you haven't heard our other Stephen King adaptations, nothing's changed with me. Only book I've read is Cujo. I've read a lot of it and everything, but it's like over 1,000 pages and everything.
That's more
So
pages
yeah,
I wanna
but yeah, so it's kind of interesting. I'm very curious on how this film will tackle a sequel to The Shining, especially since, you know, you hear people talk about a sequel to The Shining, and more times than not, they think about the movie more so than the book.
Yeah.
Which, you know, Stephen King did actually make a sequel to the book, which is what they're adapting into the movie. So, do you have any thoughts about it? Since obviously Stanley Kubrick is definitely not the one that directed Dr. Sleep, since he's been
Right.
not with us for a very long while.
He's been doing the long sleep.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the long Dr. Sleep. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I was surprised to learn there was a sequel to this at all. Yes, I learned last time on the podcast they were watching the sequel to The Shining. So, I mean, I'm interested to see where it goes. Is it a continuation of being in the old hotel? Is it the I don't know. Are they going to dig more into the actual lore of The Shining? What it means to have that gift? I don't know.
Yeah, The Shining.
The Shining.
Yes, The Shining. Yeah, I'm not really sure what it tackles. I only know.
I got nothing.
Yeah, I only know like few bits about the film, but other than that, I mean, it's like basically just a couple of drops in the bucket comparatively. So it's going to be completely new to me, and it's definitely going to be a little bit daunting since obviously I like The Shining a ton.
Right.
And so whenever you have like a movie that you consider a masterpiece, at least in my eyes, I know you rated it a 9 out of 10, the first one. I'm very curious on how they'll handle this one in comparison, whether they'll try to recapture some of that magic from either Stanley Kubrick's interpretation or stick with the book adaptation, which unfortunately I can't compare it to. So in case you're wanting book comparisons, I know there's other videos that do that. But yeah, I mean, I don't know.
I don't even know how to read.
Damn, and you're an English major too.
Hey, fake it till you make it, babe.
Yeah, that's true. That is very true, and you're living proof of that. Yeah, so I unfortunately don't have too much to say about this film, but hopefully we'll have little things more to say about it whenever we come back after watching Dr. Sleep. So be right back. You're not going to say anything?
No, I was asleep.
Oh, damn. And we are back from watching Dr. Sleep. Aaron, how do you feel now that you're awake?
I mean, holy childhood trauma allegory, Batman. I mean, that was that was a long one. We also watched the extended cut though, so I don't know how much longer than the already long movie that was.
I think it was 30 minutes longer, so it's like it's going over 3 hours.
Yeah, but honestly, not. I mean, it's kind of one of those like Lord of the Rings is also long, but it's good long, so you're fine. You're baked into it. I think this was a good movie. Still,
Oh,
it's just
that's
really,
good.
really long. Yeah.
Yeah, I would feel the same way. I mean, granted, like, I feel like Peter Jackson's adaptation, the extended cut of Lord of the Rings, it's
I
like...
haven't even seen the extended Lord of the Rings.
It's worth.
Is it worth it?
It's very much worth a watch, to say the least, because it feels long, but it also doesn't at the same time, because you're just so invested and so...
It just takes time to develop the story more, but the pace isn't bad. Yeah, it's just it takes longer time, more detail, more to absorb.
But
yeah.
And so while I don't think anything could ever top like the pacing of those films where it's perfect, I feel like Dr. Sleep, while it does feel like a long film, it is filled with pretty good content, and I feel like
it's still engaging throughout. Yeah,
it's one of those things that normally with stuff like this, I'm like, oh man, if only they edited at a faster pace and everything else like that. And maybe the theatrical cut feels like that, but the consensus on what kind of solidified me on trying to check out the director's cut is a lot of people said there's a lot of stuff that adds more explanation to it, and
I could see a lot of the stuff bringing hollow if they didn't take the time that they took with it, because I can see a lot of those scenes that like I know wouldn't be cut, like if they didn't develop them properly, I'd be like, okay,
yeah,
or like that didn't quite hit the way you wanted it to. But I think because this is such a like heavy trauma, but also weird fantasy, you got to sort of mix the two, I guess. But I think you got to let it cook. You got to let it cook a little, and I think that's exactly what this did.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that, because in all honesty, this is kind of a very bizarre sequel, both in terms of just being a sequel to The Shining, but also staying as a book adaptation.
Right.
And apparently, Mike Flanagan, who directed the film, that was going to be his biggest hurdle, especially whenever it came to talking to Stephen King about it, because with Stephen King's novel, The Shining goes in a much different direction at some of the places, but with this film in particular, they clearly took a lot of inspiration from the film The Shining.
Oh, yeah, the Stanley Kubrick version. Yeah.
And I guess that was like one of the biggest hurdles that Mike had about approaching Stephen King about adapting it, because he had to tell him, like, look, I know you really dislike Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, but everybody in the world, as soon as you say Overlook Hotel, they think of Stanley Kubrick.
Right.
Like, the imagery Stanley was able to muster up, that's forever imprinted on people's minds. That is the world of The Shining to them. And I know you don't like that, but that's what the people see. And here's my vision of the movie. And I guess, obviously, don't want to spoil anything about it, but I guess whenever he told him specifically about the ending of the movie and what they planned, Stephen King gave the approval and just went like, yeah, okay, go forth with it and everything. And I'll let you know what he thought about it as soon as the film ended. But just kind of opening it up, it's a very bizarre sequel in general because of that, because you're mixing both the book and the movie. But not only that, how to approach, it's following the later sequels that you see from films like decades later, where it's like they introduce a new cast of characters while bringing in the old one. And it's weird watching the film because there's a lot of moments where it's like, remember this from the first one?
Yeah, there is a lot of that. It is so, like, when we say it's inspired by Stanley Kubrick, I mean, down to the costumes, down to the actress that looks and acts just like Shelley Duvall, like down to so it's weird to see how closely they, especially in those when they go back to that time.
Which is weird. I don't know how you feel about this, because I don't know if we've seen a film like this on the podcast where you don't want it, whenever it comes to making callbacks or references, you don't ever want it to feel like pandering to the audience, but at the same point, it's like you have to acknowledge it. So I didn't know really what your thoughts were whenever it came to the level that a sequel like this needs to have versus trying to stay as its own original thing.
Right. I'll be honest with you. It took me a little bit to get into the film at first because it starts with a lot of that content, and it's like a fever dream a little bit, like seeing somebody act like these characters that like I don't think of in like franchise terms, but now they're like characters. Like here's Shelley Duvall's blue jacket, and then here's Danny's little tricycle and his little thing. They're like, it becomes like, here's the character, like here's how we define this character, and it feels a little bit like watching CGI Luke in The Mandalorian or something. You know what I mean?
Oh gosh,
like just like a smidge, but like ultimately I think like it's not. Ultimately I warmed up to it and I was like, okay, yeah, and I got into it. It was like a little uncanny valley at first, but I think part of that's also because it's a little more heavy on the magical elements right off the bat versus like the first, like the Shining Stanley Kubrick movie kind of builds into that magical realism, and this one is just like, bam, here's ghosts right at the start or whatever. So it's I think those two things like combined were like, whoa, okay, let me center myself at first. But then I thought once it locked in, and especially a lot of the later exploring of that sort of time in Danny's life that they do, and they bring back a lot of that set and that feeling and stuff from that's an homage to the first Shining. It's I think they did a really good job with it, honestly. By the time it's all, but that's why I think you gotta let this film cook. But like once it's all cooked, like I really appreciated a lot of that kind of stuff. What do you think? I mean, because you're such a big fan of the first Shining movie.
Yeah, it's one of those things that it was tough. It was like, if it was tough for you, it was really tough for me, because it's one of those things that like the state of cinema and how much they kind of pander, Star Wars especially
like
being the biggest culprit of that, and just like, oh, pause for audience applause and everything, and doing that and everything. There's a couple of moments I felt like, okay, this is kind of a little too close to home, but at the same point, it's like, I think it's one of those things, and this is why I'm talking about this before we even talk about the plot of Dr. Sleep. I feel like it's just kind of like a call-to-call basis. Like, not every reference is equal to one another, and moments where I do feel like it's a little like,
remember this?
Yeah, remember this shot?
Yeah.
Remember this?
Yeah.
But one thing, like, right off the bat, I have to applaud. You're talking about CGI Luke and everything, and how, like, the actor that played Luke in The Mandalorian, he looks like Mark Hamill young.
And it's weird. Yeah, it's a little weird. Yeah.
I have to give major kudos to Mike Flanagan and just the crew for having so much restraint. They're just like, we are just going to try to get as close of lookalikes as much as we can, and not try to pull any of that CGI garbage. Right. Is it one of those things that I look at Wendy Torrance and think like, okay, that's not Shelley Duvall.
Right.
Yeah, I could tell it's not. But the actress was so close to her, and there's even moments of her talking that I could have sworn sounded exactly like Shelley Duvall.
Yeah, and that's on purpose, and it's like, and it's so hard for me to separate that action of acting to meld that with the plot of the movie, because the whole time I'm sitting there thinking, I'm like, she's trying to act like Shelley Duvall.
Yeah, but it's one of those things that this is a choice that, while I can see why others would be bothered by it, I stand by this and say they did the right choice handling it this way and everything. And I think as we talk about the episode, there's going to be a lot of talks about, like, that you can clearly tell this is a reference to The Shining with here. And it's one of those things that, especially you being so good at delving into interpretation and meaning and messages and everything else like that, I really want to hear your perspective on, is this actually something deeper, or is it like, oh, wouldn't it be neat if we did this like The Shining?
This movie is like, bat you over the head. Here's childhood trauma.
Yeah.
And like, because it's about, I guess we'll get further into plot. Are we doing plot now or no?
Yeah, we're going to do plot right now, boys. Plot!
I mean, just in a general sense, it follows the story of Danny now that he's older, past this trauma, and he hasn't quite dealt with it yet, and it's ruining his life. He still sees the monsters of the Overlook Hotel everywhere he looks. And because he doesn't like that and he doesn't want to deal with it, he hits the old bottle. Well, guess what? That's exactly what his dad was doing, hitting the old bottle and then hitting the old Danny and hitting the old Shelley Duvall, you know what I'm saying? So it's, he has an opportunity to sort of cope with his past and relive it for the sake of his weird daughter figure that's not really his daughter, but they are related in the sense that they are both little shiners. They can shine, they see the shining, and he connects with this girl, and now he has a chance to save her from her trauma, or he can repeat the sins of his father by hitting the bottle again. That's sort of the overall symbolic background of all this, just sort of told under the guise of, people who shine and people who have darkness inside them. And it's like, yeah, people who have let their trauma hurt others and people that, heal and help others heal. So it's, I think the whole thing is pretty trauma-centric storytelling, to be honest with you. And we can explore some of the finer points of that in spoilers and how I think it's pretty clearly outlined. But I think this one, I think there's a lot of ones you can see and be like, this is kind of like this or whatever. But I think this movie is overtly about childhood trauma, like in every aspect. But
Okay, well, good job explaining the plot. Yeah, it takes a load off my back trying to summarize the film. But yeah, I mean, so overall, this story, because we talked about this right before we talked a movie about how do you do a sequel to The Shining and everything. How do you think the plot is as a Shining to the sequel?
I mean, I think it actually does something pretty brave and explorative in the fact that, yes, I think what horror does, especially modern horror, is, in all periods of time, it tackles things that are actual horrific things in our lives, not necessarily, when you're talking about it, Clown Scary or whatever. But the point is, that story is more about bullying and whatever. When you talk about other Stephen King things, they're often centric on these childhood experiences that are you think about a Carrie or you think about it's like these kids who are neurodivergent, but that was but that's what makes them special, and the fact and then they deal with their trauma in one way or another. So gosh, I already forgot the question you asked me because
How do you think the plot is whenever it came to the idea of coming up with a sequel to The Shining?
Right. So I think it's interesting because it's what are these characters that sort of survived the first Shining movie going to be doing later down the line? Well, probably dealing with the events of The Shining in one way or another. So I actually think it makes a lot of sense, and the way that they've turned it into horror again by not being literally, all right, I mean, sorry, Shining spoilers, decades later, but
yeah,
the guy with the axe isn't hobbling towards you saying, "Here's Johnny," but that's still horrific, and to make a horror movie that's based off that, but then still tap into all the stuff that's in The Shining, the mystical elements, the what is The Shining, that kind of aspect, and use that as the vehicle of storytelling. I think it's cool. It's a cool way to make horror, even though this isn't I don't know. I would compare it to something like Get Out, when we watched Get Out, Jordan Peele's Get Out, because that's a distinctly modern horror that I think I see a lot of innovative horror stories going in these days, where it's okay, the horror of race relation microaggressions. Sounds like a fucking shitty thesis topic, you know what I mean? But they turn it into this masterful piece of storytelling where we can all understand, and I think that's exactly what they're doing here. And the horror is real horrors people deal with, which is the trauma from their childhood, but making that into a scary monster horror movie. I thought was an interesting plot to delve in, and one that makes sense given the events of the first movie. Because that would fuck Danny up, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's one of those things that I was kind of, I mean, I had a feeling, especially because I knew this movie was closer to the Stephen King novel than the Shining novel was comparatively to the movie. But it was also sort of the same thing that I'm so used to sometimes, whenever it comes to sequels, sometimes, rinse repeat doing the same thing can work out, but you change a couple of stuff, for instance slashers. Basically there's a very loose plot that may be different, but for the most part it's just them trying to survive the killer. But I feel with a sequel to The Shining, you can't just repeat The Shining and everything. No. It can't, because then it just, you start comparing it and you're just like, I just feel like I'd rather be watching The Shining. So this feels like its own unique creature and everything that does stay tied to it. And trust me, the film reminds you that it's a sequel to The Shining with specific shots, specific music cues, just specific everything.
Yeah. If you've ever seen The Shining, you will see the parallels.
Yes, you will see.
Even if it's been years, you'll be like, oh, yes.
Yeah, you're like, yes, I remember this. I remember that. And so, like, I feel like, especially because I do covet The Shining, you know, it's a 10 out of 10 film. And, you know, hearing it had a sequel, it's not immediate like blasphemous or anything else, especially if Stephen King wrote a sequel to The Shining, because in his mind he was like, there's definitely a lot of explored ground, which Aaron already talked about, that some of those bullet points of the explored ground that's to be revisited here. I kind of came at it coolly, being like, I have a feeling there is no way this will top The Shining and everything else. Like, I'll never be like, do I want to watch The Shining or Doctor Sleep, you know, sort of thing. But given all that stuff there, I do think it is the best sequel that it absolutely possibly can be. But there are some stuff that I am just sort of like on the fence about. It's one of those things that I want to knee-jerk, like, be like, I hate this. But then I have to, like, pull myself back and think, well, let's analyze this. Let's look at this. Is this actually just sort of like Hollywood trope you're throwing in, or is this actually just something deeper? Because the problem is like, whenever it comes to a plot like this and everything else, you have to have a catalyst of sorts and everything else. Yeah. And the problem is, Danny from the first film is very much traumatized and troubled and doesn't really want a catalyst. He just wants to just be okay. He's working on that, and there has to be outside forces that encourage him to try to do something. And so
and also, I also want to know, just because this is in the beginning of the movie, so I don't feel like it's super spoilers, but he gets that visit from Doc and or whatever his name is, and the chef guy, and he teaches him how to bottle up all of his feelings, basically. Here's this fun little black box that you can put things in that scare you, and you don't have to deal with them anymore. You know what I mean? So that's sort of the basis of where we find Danny at the start of this movie, is like, he is just not dealing with things. Like, he's not dealing with his trauma at all, and that's working for him, except for it's not, because he's fucking homeless and, like, throwing up on the street and using the last of his money to get a bus wherever he can kind of situation. So, like, it obviously hasn't worked out for him amazingly, but that's sort of the setup of, like, Dan has found a way to deal with these things, but it's not necessarily the healthiest thing.
Yeah, because, like, everything that Dan went through as a kiddo is something that a kid should never be subjected to, both, like, real-life horror and more of the supernatural variety. Yeah. So I think, like, having that plot device is, again, just, is something that obviously they use later to kind of talk about, but B, also is very representative of, instead of dealing with these horrific problems and everything, just locking them away and everything else, just so you could try to be cool and collected on the surface and everything. So I think it's I liked that and everything. It's definitely just sort of, see, now I'm doing the thing. What was your question about it?
It's easy to get lost, because this is a film that deals with, like, a complicated topic in, like, I don't know, in a different kind of complicated way, because it deals with it with this weird magic system that you kind of learn that while you're watching, as it develops what the shine is and the darkness is, and so it's, I think there's a lot to unravel, especially in this fucking 3-hour movie or whatever it is.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up, because that was one of the plot points I did want to talk about, is you get to see a lot of The Shining, whereas in the film The Shining, it's very, like, lacely mentioned and everything. It doesn't make it the focal point, because really, at the end of the day, the story's about Jack and how he's dealing with his sort of alcoholism and trouble and everything else. Yeah. So seeing, like, The Shining more explored with these new powers, I didn't feel like it's sort of like, you know, oh, the Force can help bring you back to life right now, or something
Right.
stupid like that. That just feels like hammed in. It just feels more like, again, you didn't get to explore it. And so having these abilities again to stay connected, and I do like how, you know, they do make the reference, because it could easily be seen as like the return of like Dick the custodian and everything could be seen as like, oh, remember he was in the first one, so here he is now. But I think it just makes more sense because like having that sort of connection to where Dan's able to talk to Dick, even though he's been long dead and everything. And Dick even says, this is just a dream for me right now, talking to you and everything. I think not only helps better describe the powers of the Shining, but also just be the one who is able to reach out to Dan, because he's the only one that knows what Dan's going through right now. Because there's even like a big sort of discussion where he feels like Danny, as he's going through this, isn't able to connect with his mom after dealing with that trauma, and he can't really explain what's going on with him, so that just creates this big disconnect and everything. So I do think just even having a sequel to focus on the Shining powers and its capabilities, there's some moments where I'm like a little like, okay, you're kind of pushing the comfort zone of The Shining a little bit.
Yeah.
But
I do think, that is probably one of my criticisms of the movie. And I do like this movie, so none of my criticisms are that hard, you know. But I do think sometimes this felt like I was watching like a Marvel film or like a Harry Potter movie or some shit. I was like, this is like... That's sort of the beauty of Stephen King's brand of magical realism, is that his magical realism is the realism aspect still there, and there's just like these little elements, like there's just a little bit of magic to the world. And this one felt a lot more like we gotta defeat Thanos or whatever, you know?
Yeah, see, that's one of my things as well, because I guess we can kind of talk about it, but one of the other plot lines going on,
there's three that happen all at once.
Yes, exactly, because basically it focuses on Dan, then it focuses on this young girl named Abra, who is also discovered to have the Shining in her.
Abra has magic powers?
Yes, yeah. Abracadabra.
Yeah, it was a little on the nose.
Yeah, a little on the nose. But then you have like these this group that feeds on steam, as they call it.
Yeah, they're vampires, and also kind of like a racist depiction of gypsies.
Oh, okay. Well, good to know. We'll
the Romanji people,
into that.
You know, I mean, just like just a little bit. That's my fucking libbed up ass take for this one.
You're just
that's the one. Kind of problematic, sweaty. That's my moment. You just have to bear with it, but it's really not that bad. I just thought it was funny that they slipped in just a little classic gypsy racism. I was like, great, but anyway.
Yeah, you're like, that's cool. And
there's literally one line where they just describe where these people are. They're like, yes, they've lived for centuries and they used to travel in caravans overseas. I was like, yes, this old.
It's so bad.
It's a tale as old as time. It's a fucking Hunchback of Notre Dame ass shit. Like, fuck those people for being wandering homeless. Fuck the Romanji. Anyway.
But like, and that plot, that's one of the plots where I'm just sort of like about, because I do understand their place and how they are allowed the story to continue as needed. Like, it's a needed piece to continue it forward. I'm also very kind of like always like, okay, new generation of The Shining and everything else, you know, sort of like, okay, new character that isn't Danny. I feel like it's like one of those things that I just genuinely thought whenever I watched Dr. Sleep, it was going to be solely focused on Danny. And while it does divert to other plot lines as it is and everything. And obviously they merge with one another and everything eventually, but that's kind of like where the hesitation is or whatever, because I don't really know. Like, it's one of those things, if you ask me to come up with a sequel to The Shining, I couldn't tell you what I would want.
Right, that's what I was... Yeah, I had no idea what to expect going in, because I was like, that seemed like a pretty succinct story that closed itself. But yeah, what's going to be next?
But I do think, like, again, they do take a lot of the right points that Yeah, the Torrance family is probably really messed up after the Overlook Hotel incident. So yeah, let's see how like Danny is years later and everything. I just feel like the story, how it's set up and everything, needed other plot lines to help push it forward. And while the plot lines do push the story forward and everything, those plot lines in themselves, I'm just always like about. I think if I had to rank the storylines and everything, it's like Danny Torrance top part, very interested in. Next one is the Abra storyline and everything. Third is like steam vampires and everything.
Yeah, because I will say you can kind of Harry Potter the fuck out of this story, because Harry Potter is also, it's Jesus allegories all the way down. But yeah, I mean, literally, I thought it was funny that Ewan McGregor is once again in a fantasy movie about finding a precocious child that uses the magic power that he's known forever for a long, at the most powerful he's ever. Now he has to tutor this child lest they turn to evil and use their powers for the good side instead. Yes, it's literally Star Wars. This is Anakin he's found. So he just has to make sure that she doesn't turn into Darth Vader. Aberkin, yeah. Yeah, so I thought it was funny that the sequel is a little kind of like, let's get Ewan McGregor to do Star Wars 2, but he's an alcoholic now, and it's it's not exactly like that, but obviously you see how you can tie the parallels. It's they have to go defeat Voldemort and his group of bad witches.
Yeah, and like I know, like again, like you mentioned, like Harry Potter being filled with like allegories and everything. Like, yeah, I feel like this can also like. As much as I'm just sort of like, I want to criticize this, but I also feel like there is like some sort of like symbology and meaning behind it, and they do. And I'm assuming some of the lines that hit hardest are probably straight from the book. I imagine, and everything.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this, especially in the beginning, like I think that's one of my criticisms too, is that time where he's sitting with Dick on the bench and they're talking. I was like, man, they are just talking. They're just reading a passage from the book right now.
Yes, very true.
There's a few times like that where I'm like, this is just like they pulled the dialogue from the book and they're just doing an explanation right now. But,
yeah,
but no, I think the writing's really good, so I get why they do that.
Yeah, so I don't know. That's like my consensus of the plot. It's, and I feel like we could dive into certain like choices and everything else to made. I mean, obviously, if we talk too much about it, then we're basically giving the film away. But yeah, I feel like overall the plot is like it. I mean, it's very. What they want to accomplish is very complicated, and I felt like they did a fairly decent job completing it while doing some things that I'm like, okay, this just kind of feels more tropey, Hollywoodish and everything.
I'm in the same page. I think they kind of, a little Hollywood superhero action injected into this one. There's
especially one scene, and I'm pretty sure you know the scene I'm talking about, where you and I were just dying on the couch. And I do not think in the slightest they ever meant for that whole sequence to be funny.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think that's the fear. Sometimes I bring up these genre concerns occasionally on podcasts where it's like, when a film gets a little too more genre, this is the danger it runs. I'm not like an anti-genre person. I'm on a horror podcast, for Christ's sake. I love genre. But sometimes whenever you embrace these sorts of tropes and things, it like pulls us out of the story. And I think that's happened a little bit here, where we're just like, okay, and you get those reactions where you laugh to things that they probably didn't mean for that to be funny.
Yeah, but it's just the way it's set up. It's just downright hysterical. And so that's definitely going to be stuff we tackle in spoiler sections and everything. But yeah, I mean, I think you and I are on the same line. Like, very ambitious plot. Just has a couple of plot holes, in the ground.
I think this is probably one of the more difficult Stephen King novels to adapt to film, which is probably why people waited a while. I don't know when he wrote Dr. Sleep, but yeah, I do think they did a good job with it. I just think those are my two big criticisms: is the Hollywood Marvel aspects of it, of the genre that it leans into, and then some of the remember this callbacks. Those are my two that I'm like, all right. But
Yeah, it's rough, and I did look it up. The novel Doctor Sleep came out in 2013.
I think they caught on to the formula. They're like Stephen King
Yeah,
book.
oh, 6 years
make a
later.
movie.
Yeah, they could literally look and they're like, we got to make this a movie
Right.
now. So yeah, I guess with the plot mostly discussed and everything, let's talk about Ewan McGregor's performance as Dan Torrance. And not gonna lie, obviously it's hard to imagine like whenever a kid's younger what they're going to look like older and
Right.
everything. But how do you feel like the casting was for Ewan McGregor to be Dan Torrance?
As far as like likeness and stuff, I think it went fine. I think I think you can kind of be flexible in that though, because Danny is so young in The Shining that you can kind of like pretend he's going to be anything, including Ewan McGregor. I think Ewan McGregor does a good job. I love him as Obi-Wan. That's always going to be my favorite performance. I don't think he's
Fair.
like
Fair.
the smashing it out of the parkest actor ever, as far as his acting performance in this movie even. But I think he does a reasonable job. I mean, especially he's portraying a broken man, and he does.
Yeah.
You know, I think he sells that enough. You know. I'm not to be too critical for no reason.
good.
I'd probably give him like a B. He's like a B. He's like a B actor for me. I'm like, yeah, like he does good. He does good. There's actors out there that would have fucking demolished that role, but I think he did a good job portraying the Danny, like overall. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that for the most part. There is a couple of scenes where I was like, damn, that was very well acted, very good and everything. But
Yeah.
for the most part, it again, it comes down to the character itself is sort of hard to portray because he is sort of a just very quiet, kind of broken person and everything. And there is sometimes where he does sort of like talk with someone and everything else, but it is sort of hard to get a nail down on the performance. Like, again, I think I would agree with that. It's not like a smashing performance where I'm like, oh my god, he just killed every scene and everything. But there was definitely a lot of moments where I was like, that was well done. That was really well done and everything. So I'd probably be like along the same lines, like maybe B plus, A minus, I don't know, somewhere around there. Just pretty solid overall. Again, and I feel like the character Dan in this film is good for the most part. I feel like, again, it's just like his sole purpose as a character is exploring his own trauma and what he decides to do with it and everything, which I do think it's kind of unfortunate where I feel like the character itself is sacrificed a little bit, but the character itself is interesting given, like, it's not that the character itself is interesting, it's just the trauma and how they're trying to deal with it is interesting. It's just sort of like an interesting situation. And
yeah, because you get to follow like a guy in recovery, and most of the movie he's doing that while, you know, there's these two other plot lines that's like Harry Potter ass shit happening. But, you know, like he's obviously entwined into all this, and it's baked into like him dealing with his issues. But yeah, I mean, I feel like that's one of the accomplishments of this movie, is making that entertaining enough to watch, just watching a guy kind of go through it, you know?
Yes, exactly. It's like unfortunate. It's not like the character itself stands out, but like I love how they characterize him versus this is a really interesting problem this character is going through.
Yeah.
And like just dealing with that inner turmoil. So I do feel like, you know, for casting and everything, I feel like it's just solid overall and everything. Jumping over to the next one I want to talk about is Abra Stone, played by Kylie Curran. And having kid actors is like very tricky to not make them annoying but make them reasonably a kid and everything, as we've talked about. And I feel like overall she was perfectly fine and everything. She did kind of feel a little bit like the oddball kid, not completely oddball, like eating glue out of a jar sort of situation, but just odd enough to where, especially at school, as you see, she's able to hear people's voices and everything, that she probably would have a certain look about her and everything. So I felt like she did good, and she's a fan of Ruby. That was pretty freaking hysterical. Yeah.
I honestly think, I honestly think they did that on purpose, just to like subtly characterize her as like, this is a weird girl. Like she's getting bullied at school.
Yes.
She likes Ruby.
Yeah. Apologies to all Ruby fans for what you have to go through at school.
I know.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, overall, I liked her completely fine and everything. Yeah. I was invested in her story. I'd be lying if I said like, oh, I am so interested in this child, but
right.
I felt like she at least had, like, again, enough character development for me to care about her.
Right.
Trying to make it through and everything. And she is also just very well performed, especially with some of the stuff she has to do later, considering certain scenarios. But yeah, overall, I mean, it's just another thumbs up and everything else to that. Yeah. Now, one of the ones that I'm like, this is a tricky one again, and I need help kind of dissecting this. Sure. It's the performance of Rose the Hat, played by Rebecca Ferguson.
That man.
Yeah.
She's just what appears when you take too many Benadryl and you look at the
I
corner.
feel like I've seen this character multiple times.
Yeah. What her character specifically?
Just her character.
Dream girl vampire.
Yes, exactly. Sort of. And I feel like, unfortunately, like, the actress's performance, like, does what it needs to do and everything, but I didn't feel like it elevated the material.
Yeah, I didn't think she necessarily had the presence that she could, and I don't think it's the actress's fault. But I think the movie didn't quite position her to be as, like, intimidating and villainous as maybe it would have been more desired. But I thought she was interesting. I did think, because this is about trauma and stuff, and like hurting people is really the through line between a lot of the plot. They like these herself and her little band of other weird steam sucking vampires are all like fairly charismatic.
Yeah.
They're like likable enough people. They're not like, I don't know, they're like people that are like kind of not the worst, except they slurp. I don't know. I can't, except for all the evil stuff that I can't go into in the non-spoiler section. But
very Coale mentality.
I know. Well, they're just doing what they got to do to survive, and that's kind of the point. Is that like everybody here has their own survival mechanisms for their trauma or whatever, and like they are the bad. That's the bad thing that happens is when you repeat the cycle, and they're traumatizing other kids. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's like one of those things that I'm very much like I understand their place in the story. I do think, like, for the sake of the story, it's fine, but I just feel like it's just so tropey, Hollywoody, and I've seen this so many damn times.
I think what we're doing, I'm stepping back a little bit, I'm getting a little crazy with it. I think what's happening in storytelling right now generally is we've gone past the classic conflicts, man versus God, man versus nature, man versus man. We've gone past the modern conflicts even, man versus no God, man versus himself, man versus nothing, and now we're getting to the point where like we're tackling weird new forms of conflict in storytelling, and a lot of that is like man versus trauma, and I don't think we necessarily have the formula for that one down like we do man versus God, man versus nature, man versus man, when those are the points of conflict in storytelling. So getting a little abstract with it, but I think what we're witnessing here is like a lot of stories that are trying to talk about things that are really difficult to put into words and manifest, and like she ends up being a villain that's supposed to personify trauma or whatever, and that's like a big ask to make that not sound pretentious or like or like they're trying to ham-fist a moral lesson into you or whatever. But she's I don't know, I feel like they just don't give her a whole lot besides being like free spirit hippie, like lady with a hat that's like whatever, when she could have been so much scarier.
But... yeah, that's kind of what I was looking for as well, because in all honesty, she had a great entrance.
Yeah.
Like, a really good entrance of, like, okay, wow, all right, this is unnerving. And then afterwards, I just wasn't really that scared of her, and I felt like I should have been.
And I wonder, I don't know that the movie was really trying to push that she was scary. I think that was a mistake, to be clear, in a horror movie. But I think the point of that, and this might be a little too into reading the symbols, so I mean, push back if you feel like it, but I think they might have just been trying to be like, listen, the villain in this story, especially, and we can talk about this more in spoilers, but especially whenever you get to the ultimate climax of the story, it proves that, like, I think the point of them and their powers is that they are, like, charismatic, they're likable people. They're not people that you would expect to hurt you, because that's what happens with trauma, is these people that are close to you that are like, and you see her interest in the beginning of the movie with that little girl or whatever, she's reaching out and help and and then it turns out to be, not good. She's actually feeding on your energy. But that's the point of a vampire, is vampires are, and this is a modern vampire story, to be clear.
Yeah.
I mean, vampires are charismatic. They're the count. They have riches. They are powerful people. They seem like people that can help you, and then they suck the life out of you or whatever. It's a big trauma allegory. And so I think in order to make her the villain for that kind of story they're trying to tell, they make her somebody that's like, she's a free spirit traveling. She's a BPD girly, and she's gonna ruin your life,
Yeah.
So it's just like, I think maybe they tried to soften her for that purpose, but I don't know for the purpose of, like, being a villain of a horror story that it was necessarily, like, how well it translates to a movie plot.
Yeah, because, like, I agree with that. It's definitely just very, like, representative and everything else like that, but it's also at the same point, like, man, it's just frustrating. And there's another line they have later about, like, talking about The Shining and like keeping that light there, and then other people are just filled with darkness that just want to eat that light and take that away, and it's hard to shine, which is why Dan doesn't want to shine. He just wants to lock it in, and everything else.
He's learned to mask. He's learned to mask his trauma and to blend in and to not disturb or whatever, because that's his safety. That's how he's kept himself safe. I mean, the allegory's all over, man.
Yeah,
but other people find security in taking other people's whenever their shining has been dimmed, as these vampires are discovering. They take that from others, but
and so it's like one of those things that, like, deep meaning wise, it makes sense on why it's there. Surface level, it's just kind of, it still doesn't translate well.
Right, and that's the trouble, is you don't want to make your movie too deep for you. You know what I mean? It's like, all right, because it's got to translate through the plot. It doesn't. It can't be in the way of the plot, and it can't be in the way of the enjoyment of the story. And I would agree. Like, I don't think it's a total mistake the way they made her, but I think we're on the same page that, like, she wasn't quite, for the purpose of telling this weird, fantastical movie, I think she could have been a little more villainous.
I just feel like it's just, I think it's right. I think it's a suffering of just, it goes down to the root. It's not even just mistranslation or anything.
Well, I think they wanted, and this might have been effective on some audiences, but there's, like, one scene that they show that's particularly horrific. And I think they sort of just lean on that to be like, and that's why they're bad people.
Yes.
But then they never come back to, like, these are bad people, so then you're just stuck with that. But
yeah, it's kind of weird. And so it's unfortunate. I didn't hate the performance. I felt like it was fine, but I just felt like I should have been more kind of like, oh my gosh, holy hell.
She needed to have more of a foreboding presence.
But it's whatever. And they're kind of the main three focal characters that you see, because there are a lot of supporting characters and everything else. So, I feel like we could talk about some of them, but I feel like in all honesty, they'll pop up.
Exactly.
And we'll probably just mention them by name. No disrespect to anybody. I don't feel like there was, like, any performances that were, like, terrible. I guess the only other performances we could talk about is sort of like the people they bring back to play characters from the first Shining and everything.
Spoiling too much.
Yes, that'd be spoiling too much. So that's we have to be very careful. I think one thing I do have to praise this film for is, we kind of talked about some of the characters that pop up from the first Shining, how well they were cast. the locations, the flashbacks you see,
Mm-hmm.
I could definitely tell they were very careful trying to be as faithful and stick
Yeah.
exactly to the point that I look at a lot of scenes, flashbacks, and I'm like, yeah, this feels exactly like the Shining set, like
Yeah.
exactly and
I think
everything.
a lot of people in the props department had YouTube up and scrolling back a little bit. And what was that? What's the trim molding on this corner look like? Okay, let me, because they did a great job
Yeah.
recreating, at least from my memory, the hotel and those locations.
They did, and especially kind of copying the sound of Danny's trike going down the hallway. I
Mhm.
mean, it just, there's so many things that I'm like, yep, this is explicitly Shining. There's even like one small throwback, and it's whenever Dan is applying for a job and everything
Mhm.
after he left the meeting and everything else. I don't know if you noticed that meeting room. It looked exactly like the meeting room that Jack Torrance did his interview at for the Overlook Hotel thing. So that I'll have to find a picture of it. So yeah, if you look here
Oh.
and everything,
Yeah, I didn't even, because I forgot about that scene.
yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah.
I didn't even really know about this scene, but I saw it and the mannerisms and the cutting back and forth and the shots. I was like,
Yeah.
they copied that, which it's one of
rules.
those things where I'm curious about what you think about them copying scenes explicitly, whether it's sort of, again, sort of mimicking a lot
Mhm.
of deeper meaning behind it that we could talk
Yeah.
about later, but
I think what they're trying to
Mhm.
do is tie his experience to his father's,
yes,
because
I
there are
felt that.
multiple scenes where he ends up in the same exact position as his father, where sometimes literally, sometimes metaphorically, that I think we could dive into further in spoilers. But I think, moments like that are the film's way of being like, all right, because that's, I mean, when you're making a trauma analogy, trauma starts in childhood and then you inflict it onto your kids and then they do the same thing. It's a cycle. And so he's now in the spot where his father Jack was and is like, all right, and he's dealing with the same things, but is he going to deal with it the same way, hobble around with an axe and carve up people he loves, or is he going to deal with it is he going to come out and survive that?
Yeah, so I give major kudos to the amount of care that went into this film, not only with casting, but just location overall.
Right.
I mean, there's definitely some moments where I felt like they were trying to recreate some shots, and I'm like, okay, this just, I could tell that they're trying to make this look exactly like a shot, but it doesn't
Yeah.
feel like it.
There
but
are
then
some that are literally shot for shot.
But then some of the shots quite literally do feel like I am here right now, just right here in the moment of The Shining. So
Yeah.
I do have to give immense major credit, because I felt like if they didn't do anything like that, I don't think it would make the film crumble entirely, but I think it would be missing that overall feeling.
I can agree. Yeah, and I think there's some level of expectation for that when you're making a Shining sequel, that like you're gonna be making some homage back to the Stanley Kubrick classic. So I get it. I think if I had to put a number on it, like 80% of the time they were doing shit that was obviously The Shining inspired.
Yeah.
I was like, this is pretty good, and then there was like 20% where I was like, it seems a little.
Yeah, it seems a little
That
too
was
on the nose.
That was about the ratio for me. But overall, I thought it was good.
I would probably say the same in everything else. It's like 80-20 for me, where I was just like, that's a good callback. And then other ones, I'm like, you just really wanted to do this shot.
Some of them was like, yeah, I could see the reach. I could see the reach there.
Yes, exactly.
All right.
And so it just makes it a little tricky. Yeah, aside from that, horror-wise, I would say that for the most part, it's more just kind of like looming mystery, but they do have some scenes that do invoke horror and everything.
Yeah.
There's definitely one scene, as Aaron and I briefly kind of discussed, that we were both just like, Jesus. Like,
yeah.
kind of just very like, yeah, this isn't this is not a feel-good moment right now.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, I guess major kudos because I did feel horrified.
Yeah. No, there's and the worst scene in the movie, probably the most traumatic one
Probably.
is like, I don't know. I think some part of it's because you don't normally see that. I can't even say it. I can't even say it without spoiling it. But whenever we get into spoilers, I mean, yeah, you don't see. Yeah, I can't even say.
No problem. But yeah, so overall, I mean, I do have to get kudos, and also one stupid jump scare that just made me jump in my seat because it was so deep into the film.
I think I know what you're talking about.
Yeah,
With
and
the fluorescent light.
Yes, yeah. Like I didn't even feel like it was supposed to be like a usual like Hollywood jump scare. It was just like a jump scare. I'm like, God,
because I think this movie's trying like kind of do a little bit what the first one did and like build tension over time. I don't think it does it nearly as successfully as the first movie does, or at all really. I didn't feel that scared. Like the first movie is suspense that builds over time as they're stuck in this hotel, and this one is definitely a different story, but I think kind of the same way where it's so long and it's so like it's all these events. I think they're trying to build some tension. That's one of those points where it kind of you actually get the release. Or just a little jump scare, but there wasn't a lot of scary content in this movie, to be honest with you. Just disturbing more so.
I would agree with that, yeah. But yeah, aside from that, any other thoughts, tidbits before jumping into spoilers?
I don't think so. I mean, I don't even think... I was going to try to think about, like, sound design or music or something. I didn't think any of it was that remarkable.
Some sound design I thought was pretty good, like I mentioned before. But it was mostly... Sound design was mostly remarkable whenever it had to harken back to The Shining, because sound is so...
Right, and they used that to evoke the mood of the first Shining, and I thought they did a good job with those. I do think whenever you first hear the... I don't know, it's kind of funny to me.
Yes, it was sort of funny.
Because it just, that one felt like there's the callback.
Yes.
But, so I think, but overall, I mean, I guess so. I feel like it's a pretty quiet movie overall, but I don't know, maybe I'm tripping.
No, you're not tripping too much there. I would say overall it was just fine. Yeah. Like unremarkable, as I would say. Not bad, just like okay.
Yeah. But, I don't think there's anything else.
But aside from that, I guess we could just talk a little more in spoilers. So let's go ahead and give that rating.
I would say that this is a 7 out of 10 for little old me.
Okay.
I think it did a really good job handling the story that it wanted to tell, which I think was probably, if I had to guess, more impactful in book form than in movie form. But I think they did a really good job converting it over. I think the old saying rings true. If you want to make a good movie, just adapt a Stephen King novel.
Yep, still doing good so far.
Still doing good. I was a little worried in the beginning, but once I let it cook, I think, it's about a 7 out of 10. What takes it out for me really is, I don't think there's a whole lot that is like A+++++, you know what I mean? Like, I think the movie overall sits at like a B quality throughout, where I'm like, yes, this is good, this is entertaining, but it's not like top notch, you know what I mean? And but I think overall the story and the plot was what was most interesting. That's probably not that much of a surprise because they adapted a good source material. But I do think it gets a little Marvel superhero-y at times. It gets a little Hollywood tropey at times, and that will pull me out of it. It gets a little nostalgia cashing in at times.
Yes.
But overall, I do think it was a good movie. And I did think that they, it wasn't just like fan service sequel to movie. I mean, I think they took a lot of care and attention into it, and that shows. And I think it was overall a good movie. Yeah.
Okay.
7 out of 10.
All right. Not too shabby there. Not too shabby. I'm not too far behind on that sort of rating there, because I sat there and I'm just like, man, is this film this number for me? And I just kind of wavered on it. I kind of sat on it for a bit, and it really wavered back and forth for me and everything. Because, spoiler alert, this is not a 10 out of 10 film. And that's not to, like, trash on this film. I'm just very selective on what I choose a 10 out of 10.
Same.
Like, I'll give a lot more 8 or 9s and everything else. And while this is sort of the upper echelon of numbers, I I'm like really struggling to push it towards an 8. It's one of those things that I want it to be an 8, but there's too much holding it back. But I also feel like 7 for me, there was enough meat on the bone to justify it higher than that. So it's like a cool 7.5. If I did have to push it one number towards the other, probably an 8, but it's not like for sure 8 over 7. It's just pretty chill in there, because there's a lot of things I like about it. Like I said, a couple of scenes, especially sort of addressing the sort of trauma, and again, me loving The Shining so much that while I did feel a little pandered to and everything, I also do feel like it did a lot more unique stuff, to where I was just kind of like, yeah, for a sequel to The Shining, this is about as good as I can hope for, I imagine, and everything.
Yeah.
Without it just literally being like, this is just a worse version of The Shining and everything. Yeah, so 7.5 is what we rated. So, yeah, if you've been putting off watching this film and you're a big Shining fan and everything, I still say it's worth a gander and everything. There's definitely stuff you can appreciate about it. Just obviously go in not expecting it to top, but it's just still a solid adaptation overall. So that's really all you can hope for whenever they decide to make a sequel to your favorite movie, one of them anyhow.
Yeah,
so
honestly, monumental task to do.
So definitely good. So Stephen King adaptations ring true. I'm just not going to tell Aaron about the ones that have been deemed terrible.
Okay, good. Because I'm sure they are out there.
Oh yeah, with how many books he has, you know what's up. But with that said, yeah, we're going to definitely be spoiling a lot about this film, because there's definitely a lot to talk about. So Aaron, talk about the first spoiler you wanna talk about.
Florida?
Florida?
I did think it was funny. That was the first jump scare of the movie. Florida, 1980.
Yeah, that scariest place you can imagine.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, we kind of talked about, I think but the first big spoiler for me was just seeing Shining characters on my screen in this movie, and it'd be like, in the same era, like recast them all and put them in the same wardrobe and everything. That scene where, and even the very first, we get to see the first monster, and it's a monster from the Shining one. It's the fucking rotting titty lady in the bathtub.
They really loved using her.
Yeah, but that must be the property they got the rights to.
Yeah, but I do also have to acknowledge, in the movie, that's the one where like Danny was hit by her and everything. Yeah. So that's sort of the monster. So I can understand why maybe that one is the most terrifying.
Still lurking. The crimes of the father are still lurking.
Yes, exactly.
Danny boys aren't.
But yeah, that is true. But yeah, so they loved using that monster. And again, it's so troubling whenever it came to like the Overlook monsters and everything else. Like, it's troubling because it's like, on the one hand, yeah, there are specific monsters that he wouldn't forget in his head, but it's also hard not to make it feel like this is just remember this character from The Shining?
And that's what it took me. That was jarring at first for me to get into, because it was the Shelley Duvall mannerisms. It was the little Danny boy outfit. It was the custodian, right, Dick?
Yeah, Dick.
It sounds just like, you got the shot at it, you boy.
Yes.
Whatever. I'm like, okay, like they're all trying to be those characters, which I get, but it's been so long since that movie was made.
Yeah.
Seeing Jack Nicholson later was like, okay, the guy trying to be Jack Nicholson. Yeah.
Yes. Because I felt like overall the people they got casted as them, none of them, I would say, were like 100% like, oh man, this is exactly.
No, they didn't get like impersonators or whatever.
Impersonators, which I guess is more important that they have good character actors.
Yeah,
and
I agree.
And so, and trust me, as much as it is nitpicky, being like, man, that's not them. Still forever grateful they did not do the CGI and everything. Just forever grateful.
Yes, I do think this is the way to handle it, but it was still like, it was so much at once that I was like, okay, let me get into this.
Yeah, and they still did a good job. Like, overall, I would say, like, this is the best. And I knew, looking at them, who they were supposed to be.
Yes.
Just by mannerisms, the way they look, the way they dress, like, everything conveyed. I know who this character is that didn't even play the character in the original film. So,
Absolutely. But yeah, I think that first scene with him and Dick on the bench is where you really start to get the building blocks for this is what this movie's gonna be about, and it's about generational trauma.
yeah.
And it's about this guy who says, all right, you know, you're a man now, and I'm not going to visit you again, but I'm going to give you this little way to deal with your trauma, and it's how I learned how to deal with my trauma, which she reveals, because my granddaddy was mean, and he had the darkness in him, and he beat us, or whatever. And then I just, those demons keep revisiting me, because he said, even after he died, I was glad he's dead, you know, but then he kept coming back, and he kept coming back. Because he didn't process that, you know. But he shows him how this is how I deal with it. I just put it in a little box and I don't think about it ever again.
Yeah.
And that solves everything. So that's how Danny learns, is from in this sort of generational cyclical way of like, okay, my daddy did things I didn't like to our family, and he hurt us over and over and over again, and I can just put that in a little box and never talk about it again, and it'll be fine. But by the end of the movie, you find out that, of course, that's not really worked out. You know, he even reveals about his mom could still see his father in him. So, like, you know, in the fact that he would avoid it and not talk to his mom, and then his mom just dies. You know, it's like, you know, it's talking about how it's not a healthy way to deal with trauma. But I do like how they sets the ground for, like, this is the trauma allegory. And then they go and they show you the story of the little girl and her trauma she's dealing with. And she's weird and different. And, you know, people at school are like, why is that weird girl looking at me or whatever? But she's actually a giant genius. She's the smartest magic power user ever. But she has the best autism. And it's her super... I seriously think the superpowers that they have here are literally like trauma coping mechanisms if they were superpowers. I want you to think about it. They label these the dark witch people or whatever, the vampire steam suckers, label these as like this is a watcher. This is a this girl is a whatever. What do they call it? Where they a pusher.
Yeah, they gave them like nicknames and everything
of like what their powers could do.
Yeah, like snake bite, apron, chunk, flick, Crow Daddy,
right?
You know,
but this little girl, her specialty is she's a looker or whatever. So, and she's literally has like magicized hypervigilance is what it is. It's her superpower. She can notice when something's wrong with mommy daddy. You know what I mean? She knows because she's looking for these things in her life or whatever. So I think it's really interesting that like even like that's her trauma response superpower. That's her security mechanism. She's become a hypervigilant child of like needing to understand constantly or whatever. But then other people's trauma responses give them different powers, like the pusher, the woman that just kills men over and over and over because she can get them to do what they want, because that's how she's learned to deal with her things, is by pushing people and convincing them to do what they want. And that's sort of the dark side of the characteristics you develop whenever you're dealing with something you don't want to deal with. So it's interesting that even the powers are all like trauma powers. And Stephen King, I presume, has written this this like trauma power scaling magic system that's interesting, but it all relies on, and that's why they have to get little kids that aren't corrupted yet, because their shine is still bright, and they can live through them by sucking the energy out of them like vampires, and then that kills them, because you know that's what trauma does to them. So that's why I think you get this. When I first saw the child killing scene, holy shit! I know, and I know I'm just ranting, but that's what I was trying to say that I couldn't say earlier. Is whenever they suck the soul out of this child, or they tie down this child and kill him, it's like you don't see that even in horror movies of just like children dying like in horrific torturous ways typically, but that's the reality of this shit, is it gets people when they're young, and kids kill themselves, and and you know they set up these little like, you know, he's the best baseball team, and everybody, there's a lot of pressure on him because he's really good at baseball and he's got this gift and blah blah, and you know, and then somebody that has bad intentions comes along, and somebody that's been hurt themselves, you know, then hurts others. So I thought it was interesting, the system that they set up that's all based on like trauma and how we deal with it. But wacky storyline.
Yeah, it definitely, and I think you explained it a lot better than I ever could there, but there's definitely just like a lot of it going on. And again, as I've mentioned before several times, I like being able to infer a lot of stuff out of media. I mean, I think that's what elevates like sort of like this sort of medium. But again, this is like definitely book stuff.
Yeah.
But then it's like whenever you look at it on a literal surface level, it gets to be a little preposterous. But
It does.
but yeah, that child killing scene definitely messed me up, and they did a good job making me feel like a child was dying and everything.
And that's something that just from the Stephen King filmography we've explored so far. A lot of bad shit happens to kids.
Yes.
He's focused on that as a
Yeah, he really does. He really focuses on
It's like
that.
when you're watching JoJo, you know a dog's gonna get it.
Yeah.
When you're watching a Stephen King movie, you know a kid's gonna get fucked up.
Yes, that he is sort of the American Iraqi. Yes, doing that. But yeah, it definitely is sort of interesting the powers they get into. But again, it's one of those things that because the powers are so prolific, it almost feels like I'm watching a Twilight film or something like that with how it is. Which especially there's a scene that happens later where Dan and literally best guy in the world with zero flaws that you know is going to absolutely get destroyed. Billy Freeman, played by Cliff Curtis. They go out because they're trying to get these steam suckers because basically they catch whim that, oh no, they're coming after Abra. They know that she is around because, again, the way Abra is and everything, she's able to connect to a lot of people and make her presence aware and everything. And that's how her and Dan even met in the first place, which I'll talk a little bit about their relationship and everything else, but getting to sort of like the one moment that made me lose my marbles is them setting up a trap to basically where the steam suckers are out there, except Rose the Hat is like staying back because she's the leader. She's got to stay safe or whatever. And they go try to grab the child, and then turns out it was what they call a parlor trick, which, again, I love that term, but I also hate that term at the same time, where it's just like, they used a whimsical bob, you know?
They're parlor chicken. Just I don't know.
Yes.
A lot of the magic in this universe is tied to traditional magician stuff and not like wizard stuff or whatever. So she even has a little magic hat and like you can pull a rabbit out of the hat.
Oh my god, I didn't even think about that. That's so funny.
It's all boomer magic.
But yeah, whenever they have like that fight or whatever, and Ewan McGregor talks because they have a conversation whenever they're finding the boy, because Abra said, hey, just to prove like I'm not lying and these steam suckers are there, go here, there's a body buried in the ground and everything. And so Ewan McGregor and Pal have to go out and dig it up. He has this,
a boy corpse.
and he has like this whole thing talking about like, yeah, I used to hunt deer and everything. This smells like a deer that I almost caught that I found dead days later or whatever. And they have the moment of like, you got those hunting rifles? And so
that part just seemed to me like written, I don't know, that was a very Hollywood moment where it's like, this is what Hollywood imagine like people that hunt are like. You still got those old deer rifles, and then they're riding in the back.
Yeah, and then as soon as they set up the ambush for the steam suckers, and then they just start unloading Call of Duty map and everything, it was so stupid that it elevated to comedy, and I'm just busting out laughing. And I'm sure that's how it was in the book, but at the same point, it's so comedic. And
there's a lot of things in Stephen King books, in my understanding, that did not make it to the film adaptations, and they probably could have changed how that one worked out, but I guess it is the logical way to go. If like I was convinced that they were soul-sucking vampires that were just slurping up kids through a straw that had great potential, then I guess I'd probably just want to shoot them with a rifle too. From a long distance. But
it just ends up being funny as they go down one by one and everything.
That part of the film is like peak Marvel. You know what I mean? It's like, here's the fight scene. It's like, I don't know. I'm not used to like horror movies usually. Like, they set up traps, they run away, but this was like, I don't know. Part of the reason this doesn't feel like a scary movie or like a horror movie at all is because also the kid is like way stronger than any of them.
Oh my gosh, absolutely, so
like,
strong.
I never feel scared watching Star Wars because I know Anakin's Jesus Christ or whatever. He's got all the midichlorians, and it's like this one. I was like, yes, this is the precocious child that is just going to demolish all of them with her avatar powers or whatever. You know?
Yeah. That is very true. It definitely, like, it's so bad. Like, whenever it came to plot armor, I kind of, like, knew early on what was going to happen, especially, like, hearkening back to the bench where, you know, Dan is talking with Dick and everything, and I'm just like... And then as soon as they introduce, like, Abra's a girl who also has the shining everything, I'm like, Ian McGregor's going to be the equivalent of Dick to... her as so I knew, I was like, he's probably gonna die.
Right.
Probably going to die and everything, just like his old pal was fated to die by not having one flaw in him, literally just absolute ride or die bud. But helps him find stability.
That guy's set up to be like, he's kind of like you, because at first Ewan confuses him for seeing The Shining or whatever. You notice those parts where he's like, whenever you said you saw something, to be like, what did you mean or whatever, and he's like, oh, I just been like in the place where you've been before, and I get it, and I've been down on my luck, and I'm here to help or whatever. And so like I think what his character was supposed to be is like, here's the trauma that's like healed. This is what the healthy thing is supposed to look like. Like he was fucked up too. He got in a good place, and now he can help others. You know what I mean? And so what he ends up being to him is more like what Ian McGregor should be for this little girl, instead of what Dick was like, where he's like, hey, you've got the same shine that I do, and also don't let anybody ever see it because they're gonna hurt you. You know what I mean? And that's a trauma response, and he's like, this is how I dealt with my trauma of like people noticing I'm special and then taking advantage of me, so you should make sure that nobody ever knows you're special. And he's like, you're so right. And then he lives this life as an adult where his life sucks or whatever, and he passed that on to the girl by saying, don't ever let them see you shine, because they're gonna hurt you, because I've lived in this world and I've been hurt, and so don't do that because you're gonna suffer the same fate as me. And he meant well, you know what I mean? But then he sees this other guy, and that's why I think it's important that he took him on the journey with him or whatever. He's like, okay, this guy has helped me heal genuinely and real, and he said, oh, you actually have to confront these things. And so he's like, all right, we're gonna confront the problems in your life instead of running away from them, which was interesting. And then they even did the revenge arc, which was the whole like, she's like, I want to kill these people because they're hurting that boy or whatever. And she's like, yeah, revenge, revenge, revenge. And then they go and they kill a bunch of them, and then she gets kidnapped too, and then his good friend dies or whatever. And that's the arc that's supposed to be like, look, the revenge thing doesn't work. It feels good in the moment. They got their deer rifles out and they blasted some vampires or whatever. But the end result is, and that's what that with Crow driving in the car, he was like, listen, the end result's the same. Like, you still got kidnapped. I'm still dragging you here. But the difference is a lot of people died or whatever. So that's sort of the movie's lesson of like, revenge doesn't work. What does work is they have to deal with their trauma, and that's why they go back to the Overlook Hotel, so he can deal with his trauma directly and talk to his dad again. Which that whole thing I feel like is going to be a whole discussion within itself and everything else. I'll definitely have a lot to say. So in the midst of not forgetting what preceded that, because I do feel like the Overlook Hotel is sort of the final big act with a lot of stuff. Descent into hell chapter, yes.
There's I don't know, it's oh man, it's so bad that watching this film and everything, again, talking about these steam vampires, like I thought it was interesting what they represented and everything else, but every time it went to that plot line, I'm like, it's starting to tap out a little bit.
It's that one felt like old style literary, you know what I mean? There's certain, and that's not necessarily a bad feeling. That's how I feel every time I watch Breaking Bad. It feels literary, but in a good way, you know?
Yeah.
It's like, yes, it's a little like, it's got that literary cheesiness to the symbolism of like, I'm Walter White, and there's Jesse Pinkman, and here's, you know, it's like Negra Arroyo Lane. It's like, yeah, I get the color thing you're doing here. Like, I get it. Like, but it's charming and it's nice, and you know, so I think that sometimes, but then other times in plots like these, it could be like, all right, you're doing the literature thing. I get it. The curtains are blue.
Because like the steam vampires, I felt like they did a good job, especially with Snakebite on like their whole process on them existing as a group and everything, whether they feed or they convert and everything. And so them like looking for people that also have those special abilities, you know, it does make sense. One of the things that did throw me the frick off is in the Steam Vampire group. One of the actors plays Lurch in the 90s Addams Family films. And it kept distracting me because all I kept seeing is like, that's Lurch, dude. That's Lurch. So Coale Struckian. Sorry if I absolutely mispronounce it. And it's so bad, like having such an iconic person in my mind that I can't separate it and everything. It's kind of like how it was like whenever I first like watched films, and like one of the first films I remember seeing Tom Hanks in was Forrest Gump, and so every other film I'm like, I keep seeing Forrest Gump. But anyways, and I like them explaining sort of who they were and everything. I didn't question who they were. I was curious on how extent their powers were, since they feed on, like, I'm assuming it's the souls of people, right? I don't know if it's like the souls are shining and everything.
It's basically that is they feed off of their life energy or whatever, but they seem to reference it as the same thing as the Shining. It's like, that this boy's really special. He can see. He can almost like he sees the pitches before they happen or whatever. And it's like, so they like feed on potential, I guess. But
I guess, but yeah, so they feed on it, and so that is one thing I give credit. I never really questioned it, but there is sometimes the extent of power where I was like, okay, I guess you could do that. Like Rose the Hat being able just to like meditate and be able to fly across the world.
Astral project.
Astral projected everything, which I do like that scene, but not for the reason you would think. Because a lot of times they have like these villains that have these superpowers, and the main characters are weak because they need to make the bad guys a threat.
Right.
But what's great is that Rose goes into Abra's mind, and she's like, oh, filing cabinet. Let's look at me. And then it closes, and Abra's like, yeah, I knew you were going to come and find me, so now I'm going to destroy you in my mind and also invade your mind, so I know everything about you. And so I actually liked that sort of like subverting expectations and everything, because I knew like Abra was going to be okay. I didn't realize she was going to be okay because she was going to mess up Rose and everything.
Right.
And that it's sort of interesting, and again sort of dives into another interesting aspect is good old Grandpa Flick is I forget what they say, is like turning, fading away, whatever.
He's not like super well, I guess, for most of the movie, and then he does end up dying whenever she gets her head invaded or whatever. Yeah. Because he sounds like he's the oldest in the group. Whenever there's death scene, she was like, you felled kings and saw the Roman Colosseum or something. It sounded like he'd been walking the earth for a long time.
Yeah, and I do like that how as soon as he dies, like people that were like so grieving and everything else immediately fed on that.
I think that builds into, because there's two things that's funny about the smoke sucking shit. One is it's literally like drug use. It's like let's all snort this thing and then we get a high off of it or whatever. It's like, and they kind of established that level of trauma earlier in the movie whenever Ewan Gregor wakes up next to that chick who barfed herself or whatever.
Dude,
remembers that they did lines of coke last night and like, did all this escapism, and then he sees the child that she has, and then of course they die and they come to haunt him as like, nobody came and found us because you left us there or whatever. So another mistake that he made that based out of trauma that builds more trauma or whatever. But it's centered around like drug use and being a bad parent, I guess. And so like that's functionally what these guys are, is they're like bad adults that are doing drugs to escape from the reality of life, which is that you have to die at some point, you know what I mean? And then you have to deal with all your trauma. But no, they're extending it for all time by never not being high, by always having enough of this smoke in their system or whatever. And if they can't get it from their little camsters, then they gotta get it from some young, bright, bushy-eyed, by telling them to get off their lawn or whatever their fucking trauma responsive. Yeah, whatever the allegory is supposed to be there. But like it's so I think it's interesting on two levels. That it's like, hey, it's like drug use, but then it's also like a funny grief allegory that like these people are so messed up and traumatized that like once this embodiment of historical trauma dies or whatever, they're all just huffing it up like, I need the chaos to thrive in my life because it's the only thing I'm used to, even if it's my friend dying. It's like gotta get that in my system. I need that energy. I need to feed off of chaos or whatever their fucking dark energy is supposed to represent.
And so I felt like that was actually a good solid moment to represent that, because they act like they're a community that have each other, but as soon as you go down, like they just immediately want what you have
something
left.
else controls them. It's the drug, it's the bottle, it's whatever the escapism is.
But and you actually mentioned a very good point about Ian McGregor and kind of like the time skip. I was definitely surprised to see him be kind of definitely just a drunken mess and everything else. And I do like the scene or whatever where basically, he does wake up and like the girl's vomited there, and then as soon as he's like stealing money or whatever, he sees like a kid there and everything. Which fuels on what this whole story is like hurt people passing on that trauma to their children. But... and they could have made him like a jerk and everything, and while what he ended up doing I wouldn't say was definitely not the stand-up thing to do, it's a believable thing where he's like, okay, well I'll at least put you with your mom and maybe grab some Cheez-Its and you could eat there for a while. But I was surprised that's I keep wanting to say Scatman Crothers' character and everything, because that's who plays Dick in the first one. But Dick arrives and everything. It says like, nope, you can't lock up this memory. This is something you have to live with or whatever. And I'm curious as to why he says that, because I guess it's his deliberate decision as opposed to the Overlook Hotel. That was stuff that was out of his control in the moment of happening to him. Yeah, I was curious about that, but... yeah, it does have like that horrific scene where he wakes up seeing the two dead bodies in the bed next to him, just to kind of reflect that, his actions did this and everything, and that's the ghost he has to live with. So I thought that was interesting, but thank goodness that was never revisited ever again. Doing that. But overall, I do like his journey about like just trying to travel as far as he can, and he just coincidentally finds this guy who's willing to help him out, literally pay 2 months rent. Again, just sort of alludes towards that shine and everything else that you mentioned.
And I think it was cool actually if you noticed that in a lot of the scenes that both of them are in, the way they lit it in particular is he literally has like, you could see the shine in both of their eyes.
I did not.
I go back and watch some frames, but there's like whatever spotlight they use, like in that scene and the scene where they're digging up the child, like in any of the scenes where he's at the like at his door at 4 a.m. or whatever. Like I feel like they maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I think they specifically had a big spotlight or whatever, because you could see like the little white dot of shine in both of their eyes just naturally from the lighting. But
I probably would say that it was intentional and I just completely missed it, so good catch there and everything else. I think that is definitely intentional.
But the worst version of the shine in the eyes they did was what it was, the CGI White Walker shit.
Oh yeah, that was
where all their eyes shine. Like, I don't know how I felt about that. That was some of the Marvel-y moments to me where it's like, these people have powers. You can tell because their eyes glow.
I just felt I get it, because I know that whenever they used the shining powers in the original Shining, it just looked more like they were having a seizure, and I guess they just wanted it to look more cool, I guess. Yeah, but it was it was goofy. It definitely most certainly was goofy.
They use their powers and they do like Storm from the X-Men, they just roll their eyes back in their head.
Superpowers, but
that was a little overused. But...
but there definitely was some moments that I did like whenever it came to The Shining. Like, for instance, I do love how they coincidentally have like the room Dan is staying in, where it's like, some mathematician was staying here, painted the whole board with like sort of like a
blackboard material.
Blackboard material, and that's sort of like the writing. And then one day you know, you see a hello, but it looks exactly like a hello that Abra had written to a card for her mom and everything. So you knew exactly who it was. And I thought that was like, that's actually kind of smart, you know, just giving like, hey, here's how she wrote hello. And then you recognize it and you're like, oh, this is Abra. And I love his response is like, hi.
Yeah.
And then they just have like conversations and get to know each other. And so I don't know. I was like, that's cute, not gonna lie. Just sort of like people with similar powers being able to talk through board and everything else.
I also love how they kind of handled their relationship as it developed.
Yes.
Like, giving it real world, like, context and implications, where they're like, she's just a child, so she hasn't had this spoiled for him yet. But Ewan McGregor's an adult who's lived a life, and so he has to be the one that's like, you can't meet me in a park.
Yes,
I'm
like,
an adult man meeting a 13-year-old girl. This looks bad for me, you know? But, like, it's because she's the innocent. She's the, like, has not been spoiled by these evils yet. And he's the one that has, like, lived through that and is trying to protect her and himself from things that's, like, that's scared. So I thought it was interesting how, but at the core of it is a story of what's important is, like, this, a man reconnecting with his inner child in the, like, as most direct way as you could do it while keeping it as a normal story. He's not just reconnecting with little Danny, he's connecting with an actual child that has the same power that he thought he was unique to him, kind of thing. So it's a telling of, like, yes, he gets a second chance with this child or whatever to help her out and her gift, but also, you know, it's he's fundamentally different than her because he has lived this horrible life of this horrible world that he's in and seen the horrors and has been affected by them, and he doesn't want her to be. But...
yeah, they really handled the relationship very realistically. Especially, again, I do love the, like, this is horribly wrong. I should not be talking to you in the first place. But then, secondly, whenever it comes to her being like, there's this baseball boy who's, like, in trouble, we need to save him. And it's just like, what do you expect me to do about it? Because I feel like anytime they ever have these, like, we need you to do this, and the guy's like, no, I'm not going to do it because I'm an asshole.
Right.
Doing sort of stuff like that. And so it's like, you could literally tell, like, okay, this person's in the right versus wrong. But here it is sort of like a gray thing. It's like, yeah, that sucks, but, like, what am I supposed to do? Get up and drive all the way out there and deal with this?
Yeah, it's like she's like, I want revenge, and he's like, you know, like,
yeah, kind of like
he's like, I've lived this life, and, like, I don't want to be. He tries to help her in the way that he knows how, which is like, bottle it up, don't talk to anybody. And then he realizes, okay, well, you have to face this somehow. Yeah. And they both commit the same mistake together, which is revenge, and it backfires, and then they have to do it over again the right way, which is cool. I mean, I do think it takes a 3-hour movie to show that trauma recovery is not linear, because they go up and down and up and down until they finally settle on, like, all right, he has to go back to the hotel. He has to go back to the place.
Yeah, we have to. It was so bad because, like, by the time it had gotten to that moment of, like, we have to go back, I was just, like, laughing because, like, I was thinking to myself, like, okay, they've definitely harkened back to The Shining and everything. I'm sure they're going to show more of the Overlook Hotel in some capacity, like whether it's him, like, mentally, like, visiting in his mind and it looks like, you know, the Overlook Hotel or whatever. I knew the hotel was going to pop up. I just knew, but I was, like, genuinely surprised, which I guess in the book they actually do go to the grounds of the hotel, because that's how they deal with the trauma. They're just going right where it started, like you mentioned, and everything. I guess one thing I also wanted to mention is for folks at home who weren't with us, which is everybody, whenever we were watching the film, Ewan McGregor, as we mentioned, he was at a job interview where he basically worked as a hospice nurse and everything, kind of helping out and everything. And they had this cat there, and it was pawing at one of the rooms. And I was telling this funny story about this cat that would go up to these people about to die. And it was always correct. And sadly, the cat passed away and everything. So there goes their trekker. And so I made a joke. I'm like, oh yeah, this reminds me of this cat that would go to people whenever they're about to die. So the cat goes into the room of a guy who's about to die. And so I was like, well, I am sorry. I inadvertently spoiled the film. I did not literally expect them to go that route exactly. But I felt like it was a good moment for Dan to kind of recover as a person, because he's going to the AA meeting and everything to try to get over his alcoholism. And I do like that they do have a time skip to realistically just be like, okay, he's had like 7 to 8 years to recover and everything, and connecting with these people and just talking about death in general and everything. I felt like were good, solid moments, not only for his character, but just good moments for overall feeling of the film and everything.
Yeah.
So
I was scared when they got that job. I was like, oh man, this guy that gets visited by dead people is now gonna get connected with a bunch of dead people.
Yes, yeah, I was kind of worried it was going to be more used horrifically, but it wasn't, and I think that was a good call.
I think so too. I think it showcases like the superpower and sort of sets up the end of the movie, and this is the power that Dan has. That's his trauma response. That's like the good power, which is the power of empathy. You know, whenever you go through traumatic things, you gain the ability to understand what other people have gone through. And so that sort of it becomes his sort of superpower and gift of using the Shining of sorts. Is like he sits there and he sort of reads their mind or whatever, and he talks about, you know, what they went through and reminds them of things, and it gives them peace as they can pass on. And so that ends up sort of being like the setup for like, all right, this is how you deal with trauma. This is how you're going to deal with the conflict of the movie, is to approach it with radical empathy and embrace it and move on, you know.
Yeah, and it's and I guess ultimately I don't think there's other stuff that happens, but it's kind of small potatoes in comparison to everything.
A little bit, yeah.
A little bit.
I'm trying to think of other stuff then.
Yeah, because there's like small stuff like just knowing about the extent of the powers and steam vampires talking, and
there's a lot of that.
It's not bad stuff, but it's not remarkable stuff that we feel like we need to tackle and everything, especially whenever it comes. I feel like the biggest thing, and I knew this would probably take up a lot of the conversation, is sort of the final act, which is the decision to go back to the Overlook Hotel and everything. And I like it, and I also hate it with the way they made it kind of just like, again, like you mentioned, the music cue, like throwing like, you know, we have to go back where it all started. You know, because that's the one, because I guess he like has this idea of like, this is the only way we can beat Rose the Hat, I guess, is going to the most fucked up spooky place in the world.
I guess so. Yeah, his reasoning is like, this person is dark and dangerous, but she shares the same powers as us, and she's more powerful than both of us right now, but if it's dangerous for us to be there, then it must be dangerous for her to be there. Yeah. And the devil I know versus the devil I don't, I guess, is sort of his in-movie logic reasoning to be like, yeah, like, I'll take her here because this place is bad news, but at least I know my way around it, and she doesn't yet. You know?
Yeah, and it's so bad because, like, they make this big scene about, like, you know, in her little RV caravan, as it were, where she huffs on to, like, the steam, as they call it, and everything, and she goes through and decides to huff all of it because all her compatriots are dead. Oh man, that is one thing. We keep talking about Overlook Hotel, and I'm like, wait, there's this one little nitpick thing is whenever Crow kidnaps Abra and everything, and I do like the turmoil that Ewan McGregor goes through and everything, seeing like, oh my god, her dad's dead, my best friend's dead, and then he's so close to drinking, so close to just doing that muscle memory sort of drinking thing, and then he chooses not to and everything. It throws it down, and I felt like the tension of that moment, because I know how it is anytime you're trying to just not give in to one of your toxic negative traits and everything, and you're just so close, and then you're just like,
it's so easy to just escape into something else, you know.
Yeah,
whatever that might be for you. For Dan, it's alcohol, you know.
Yeah. And you know, they have that, and then of course they still have red rum on the wall, which again, I'm just like, yeah, of course. You know.
That's that aspect is like, I feel weird about, because it is, half of it is like, remember this, but then the other half is also like, this is what the movie is about. It's like dealing with
so
the
it's
most traumatic aspects of your
really
childhood.
Yes, Aaron, it does really tread on that line, which drives me crazy. Now I'm like, is it just pandering, or is it actual universe good reference, especially for him to see that red rum again and know what it means and everything. It's like doing that, but yeah, having the superpower of just like, oh yeah, Shining is just like a radio, you just gotta tune in and everything, and Ewan McGregor's able to get himself metaphysically in the van with her, just like Abra had done repeatedly, because obviously she gave in to the power to learn the power, whereas Danny was told to repress it, hide it, and not work with it and everything.
Right.
And so as soon as there's the big reveal about like, Ian McGregor is possessing Abra and everything, and just the sheer coincidence, Crow's not wearing a seatbelt because he feels invincible, and uses the Shining to turn the car and hit a tree, and Crow goes torpedoing out the window. I felt like it was just one of those things again. I'm like, well, that was very convenient.
Yeah, I guess
a little bit.
Because it's weird that these like vampire creatures are immortal, but not to like physical harm. I guess they just live a long time.
Yes, I guess they live long as nothing just outright kills them. Like,
right.
I guess they can't get sick. Or...
I guess a kind of cool way to think about vampires, but I guess I would not feel immortal completely if that was the case.
No, absolutely not, dude.
I'd still wear a seatbelt, yeah.
Yeah, I know, but I don't know. Yeah. Just, I guess people are different and everything.
And also, whenever you consider the sort of allegorical nature of the movie, it is a little bit like, the guy waving around the bottle beating the kids doesn't think the kid is going to take a swing back. You know what I mean? Like, I guess, but just to give it a little credit there. But yeah, it is a little convenient plot point. But.
Yeah, but overall, I still felt like it was fine. Yeah, them going to like the Overlook Hotel and everything, on the way there is just funny, especially with how Abra has to deal with like because I was sitting there thinking, well, her father wasn't happy about initially hearing about like, oh, you've been hanging around with this 40-year-old man. What the hell's wrong with you?
Right. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, he explicitly told her, like, show him, don't tell him. But she told him about her friend Dan that's coming over, or whatever, the 40-year-old man. It's like, yeah, of course, his first reaction is like, I'm going to fucking kill you. Because, like, that's what I would do too. But I do love that, how realistically all of that was handled, where he was like, show him, please. Like, and then he does, and then Ian McGregor approaches him with radical empathy, even though there's this guy that just was, like, threatening to kill him for knowing... probably the person he's most connected to in his life at this part of the movie,
Yes.
And but he still approaches that with like, hey guy, like, are you all right? Because he understands, he has the radical power and empathy or whatever of being like, yeah, no, I get this looks fucking bad. Like, I understand, but thank you for explaining. And that was your job to talk to your parents about about this trauma thing that you're going through right now. I can't do that for you. Like, you have to explain it to him.
And unfortunately, that does lead to him being killed, even though he tried attacking Crow, which you knew how it was going to go. But I love, like, because I was sitting there, I'm like, how's the mom feeling all this? We haven't seen the mom in a while.
Yeah, she's just gone for a while.
But she tries to call up Abra and everything, and she's like, what do I tell her? It's just like, I don't know. And so she picks it up, and she's like, hello. It's like, oh my god, Abra, are you okay? Oh my gosh. She's like, love you. Hangs up.
She's like, where are you? And she just goes, love you, and hangs up the phone.
And then drops the phone out the car.
Yeah.
And then drives off, which again, like, as soon as they're heading to Overlook Hotel, it's like so cheesy because they repeat a lot of the same shots, like that, flying cam over the lake,
and then driving up the
mountain and everything. And I'm like, I get it. Yeah. Like, it's like following the same path, but it also feels cheesy as hell. Yeah. It didn't really feel like the epic, like, oh shit, they're going back.
No, right, because it is a callback of something that was an epic swooshing thing. And
yeah.
So
the only thing I will say that I will absolutely admit to being like, okay, this is actually cool for me, is whenever they're pumping gas at the gas station, like, it's starting to snow barely and everything, and then snow is very much part of that area and everything, so just seeing the little flakes of snow drop, I'm just like, oh, they're getting closer. They're getting closer. And so, like, that's like, okay, you got me there, movie.
Yeah.
You hooked me there.
And it's also great from a visual storytelling point of view, because they keep on going back to the inside of Dan's mind, which is that snowy maze with all the lockboxes. And so, like, because this is fundamentally a symbol of him diving into his own mind, diving into his own trauma or whatever, it's like, evoking that. Like, we're going deep into his brain. The snow is starting. We're about to enter the mind of Dan. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't even pick up that. That's even more awesome. But yeah, I do like the unique choice that they show. Like in his mind, it's just remnants of that hedge maze, because obviously that's pretty much the last thing he remembers as he's trying to escape, and everything is just running for his life through that maze and everything. So I do think it is a good narrative and film choice to make that the recesses of his mind and everything. But whenever they go to the Overlook there, I am surprised that they do leave the car running and on and everything. It's because I'm like, if that sucker runs out of gas, like, I guess you could maybe see if there's other gasoline around, but yeah, overall, but this is so tricky, but like also I understand why they did it, about him being like, you have to stay out here. Why? Because we have to explore my character further and have finality with it, as opposed to, it's very dangerous. You know, I need to warm things up. But, you know, he goes in and he turns on the hotel and everything, which I'm like, how does he know how to do that? But I'm like, his mom always had to do everything around the hotel, and she constantly had to watch him as well. So I'm sure he, even at 5 or whatever, he's like, okay, I remember my mom would go to his room, do that.
Well, the hotel also seems to be coming to life as he walks through it.
That's
true. I mean? Like,
so
all the
it's
lights come on only as he walks past them. It's like him reviving those memories in his brain, you know?
Oh, good call. I do like the hotel as well. Like, I didn't feel like 100% like this feels like exactly the same set, but I looked and I'm like, yeah, this is the Overlook Hotel.
Yeah, absolutely.
And everything.
And I think it was to its advantage that it's now in a very different state than whenever you see it in The Shining. It's run down, it's decrepit, and so it's supposed to look like a shell of its former self, and it kind of does,
Yeah, and I do feel like he definitely spends a long time. Like, this felt like, yes, this would be part of a sequel of The Shining and everything, revisiting the old locations and the hotel, and like the room they stayed in
a creepy, old, decrepit kind of style. I mean,
yeah, doing that. So I felt like that time for him to wander around and everything was important for the film. It just kind of, again, just sort of does feel like this is more so for the audience's sake than plot sake and everything.
Yeah, but when you consider the plot is, you know, whenever it's an allegorical plot like this, that
oh no, I just meant like
shit. But like surface level plot, like go sit outside in the car or whatever.
Just let me know when she arrives.
It was. I feel like it was necessary because of the kind of film it was. But yeah, it is a little
bit, but at the same point, I'm willing to forgive it. It's not like a major hit across it. It's just like, okay, yeah, this is him just really exploring the trauma, as it were, and everything.
Because he had to go meet Lloyd.
Yeah, I know that scene is. I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, there's a couple of scenes that I'm like, yeah, Ewan McGregor definitely hit it. One of them is him whenever he's back in his room and he's about to drink alcohol and then throws it on the ground. I'm like, I believed that. I believed that whole thing. The second thing is him talking to Lloyd, like walking into that same bar area where Jack's descent just really like began. And I mean, he was already descending, but where it was like finalized and everything.
Where he spiraled all the way down,
I do like, you know, I like that scene a ton. I felt like that scene, I mean, probably was exactly the same as it was in the book and everything, but like even shot, it was just done so well, because you see like the singular glass there completely empty, and whenever Dan comes up and sits there and he's like, oh, scotch, you know, drink of choice there. And so whenever he's poured a drink, it's whiskey, which I definitely thought was an interesting choice, because I'm like, they've been showing the alcohol that he always goes to and drinks and everything, and this one is Jack Daniels and everything, and he's like, this was my father's drink of choice there. And then I'm like, oh no, we are really going deep into it and everything. And it was even more surprising to learn that Lloyd looks a hell of a lot like Jack Nicholson as Jack Torrance and everything. And that was definitely like a whoa sort of moment, because again, this is like Dan dealing with the trauma head on, like the source of it all and everything, and looking at it and having moments of like, you know, talking to him is like, I can't believe what you did to like me and mom and everything. And he's like,
Mhm.
I believe you've mistaken me for somebody else. Take the drink. Your credit's good. Take the drink.
Right, I
Yeah.
love that because obviously it's a mirror of the scene when Jack Nicholson is talking to Lloyd in the ballroom and in The Shining. But it's I love that it gets flipped on its head like that, where this is not a man who is there to succumb to his trauma like Jack Torrance was and spiral all the way down. This is a man who was the victim of that and is trying to avoid becoming like his father that he now sees at the bar across from him. And his father has lost that battle because he is now the guy at the bar across from him that was serving him drinks or whatever. He is now Lloyd in his mind. But I love how they handled the trauma aspect of him being like, you did this to me, Dad. And that's not, to him, that's not Dad anymore because he lost the battle. You know what I mean? That's not, Jack Torrance isn't Jack Torrance anymore. He is at the bottom of the bottle. You know what I mean? He lost the battle of mental health fundamentally at the end of The Shining and fucking died. And now he's at the Overlook Hotel. And so, I thought it was interesting that he's like, this is how I solve my problems. This is how you can solve your problems. Drink, 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 drink.
Yeah.
That part of him is still very much alive. But the part of him that's like, Dad, don't you remember traumatizing me? It goes back to the old saying of, like the tree remembers, the axe forgets. You know what I mean? Literally the axe in this point where he's like, the here's Johnny, axe wielding murderer. He doesn't remember doing that to them because that wasn't him. He wasn't himself. He was drunk. He was Jack Daniels. He wasn't Jack Torrance. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I thought it was really interesting how they handled that because he's confronting his dad, doing something he fundamentally couldn't do because his dad's dead. But he's going back and addressing the trauma and addressing this traumatizer who reacts to it in the most textbook traumatizer way, to be like, I don't remember that, because for him that was the worst day of his life, and for Jack Torrance that was Tuesday. You know what I mean? That was him, another day, another shift at the Overlook Hotel.
Yeah. And I like that. I definitely liked it because I thought that this spirit was just going to only copy the face of Jack Torrance and not actually be Jack Torrance, because he plays it off first like, I believe you mistaken me for someone else.
Right. I'm not the monster. No, I'm not that guy.
Yeah.
I'm just Lloyd.
And then there just comes a moment where you see the actual Jack Torrance slip out, that sort of just anger, that hate, that vitriol, that sort of self-disgust, to where he even takes the swig of the drink and everything.
Right, because the escapism didn't work for Jack. You know what I mean?
And so, because like that was kind of like the big question of like sort of the spirits of Overlook Hotel in the first film. And while I feel like they do kind of talk about it more and who they are and what they are and everything, I still feel like they shroud it in that same mystery as the first one a little bit. Because ultimately, it's just sort of like just dark forces there that especially attack Dan because of their shine and everything else like that. Just like they mentioned with the steam vampires, this one is just more of the pure concentrate version of that. And so that whole scene, and especially having again Lloyd, aka Jack Torrance, lose his mind, and the only way he can respond is being violent as he slams the drink across the counter and everything else. And then he just snaps back to normal, like, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, here, let me please clean you up before management notices or whatever. Like, that scene was so powerful. And so, again, major kudos to the actor who played Jack Torrance. And again, same with Wendy and Dick. Carl Lumbly, who plays Dick Halloran, as it were. And Wendy Torrance being played by Alexandra Asoy. And then I think the credit that he gets is actually bartender, I believe, is Henry Thomas and everything. But overall, like, all three of them were cast good, and I knew exactly who they were. Like, as much as I wish it could have been like perfectly, Shelley Duvall, Scatman Crothers, and Jack Nicholson, I feel like this is still the best call they could. And again, just him dealing with his dad, as opposed to whenever Jack was going through this, the face he saw and everything, I think was like somebody he knew previously, right?
I think so. I don't remember the specifics of that scene.
But I think just Dan having to face his own father, also being the face of the Overlook Hotel, is so powerful and everything. And ultimately, unfortunately for Ian McGregor, it starts to seep into him and everything, because basically the hotel is starting to turn him against the girl and everything. And that's whenever she gets a call of like, oh, hey, Rose is here and everything. And it's so goofy the way they line it up, but they look down the hallway whenever they both gather up and they're trying to get ready, and they see the axe on the wall and everything. And I'm like, yeah, okay, just, Luke's lightsaber, gotcha.
Yes, it was very much that moment, yeah.
And of course, like, whenever Rose is going through the hotel, I was like, I'm surprised they haven't shown the bloody elevators.
Yeah, and there
Cute
it is.
bloody elevators, and then she just kind of smirks it and continues on, and I'm just like,
it's like they had to shoehorn in all of the icons.
Yes, I think that's my problem. It felt more fan servicey.
It did. Those moments and like having the twins back, the twin girls in the hallway, all that kind of stuff felt a little like.
Well, the real question is, where's the man and the bear in all this?
True.
Yes.
Yeah. I forgot about them.
Yeah. I think definitely that would have pissed Stephen King off if he saw that and everything. Yeah. And of course they start the duel in the room where Jack would type for his novel and everything. Typewriter's still there.
Of course she goes and does like a thing on it and like clicks it or whatever. She's like,
But yeah, and then of course, like, again, this is like where I'm like, I like this, but I also hate this at the same time. It's just definitely back and forth, but they start to have like a battle, and then
a mind battle.
Yes, a mind battle, as it ends up being, because she's dragged into someone's mind and everything. And so for some reason, I guess she thinks that she's in Abra's mind and everything with the hedge maze, which of course they have to zoom out of the hedge maze as she's wandering around, mimicking the same shot they had previously. So I was like, hey, remember that from The Shining?
Remember that?
Which I understand. It's like cool iconography and everything.
It does read a little Kubrick fanboy-y.
Yes, a little bit. Like, I need to recreate this shot, which
it was
I get.
Genius when he did it that I'll just do it again and everybody will jerk off right in the theater.
Yeah, and if I don't do it, the fans will fucking kill me.
Yeah, I don't know.
And then it turns out it was like a big ruse for Abra to distract her by like repeating her mind, like running past her, crying her legs, and Dan's trying to lock her up in that same box that he puts all the other demons, but she's able to break free because I guess she's stronger now. And then of course they recreate the famous scene, shot like 137 times with Shelley Duvall in a baseball bat, except this time it's Ewan McGregor with an axe kind of swinging down and everything. And, they have like a talk, and I'm so distracted because I'm like, this is just the first movie and everything. Yeah. And I understand they wanted to recreate the shot, and it's like also, I don't know if they're doing it for fan service or just trying to, again, put him in the exact steps of his father and everything. Because if you look at it, his father was also a recovering alcoholic, just like Dan was. Gets the same job, that's why he mimics it so much, following the same paths like you mentioned. So but this time it's like weird because he's in his mother's steps and he's the one being pursued. So it's just like...
Yeah, but he quickly flips to the father's steps, right? It's to show how the victim and the perpetrator are one and the same, right? Because he's the one defending himself and trying to defend his child, which is exactly what Shelley Duvall's character, Wendy, was doing. And he's trying to defend Danny, but also herself from this trauma, but then it gets flipped back on him because he's defending himself against the Hat Lady, but the Hat Lady's the one that's there to traumatize him and use all of his own issues against him because she's that's her trauma superpower. She's a manipulator, you know what I mean? But
yeah, and so then of course he gets stabbed a bit and then thrown down the stairs, and then she starts to like invoke a lot of pain in him just to get a whiff of his steam and everything.
Right, she brings out the trauma in him. She wants to. She's one of those people that traumatic people tend to attract, which is other traumatized people that need to create more trauma because it's what they're used to.
That is true, especially with how much she said he was handsome and everything. Several compliments.
That's why because they made a distinction pretty earlier in the movie about like, do we take these people or do we suck them? You know what I mean?
Yes.
And she immediately identified him as somebody that we should have taken. They're like, where were you all of our life? Seriously, where have you been hiding? You have a great gift, but it's tainted by this sweet taste of whiskey, she says. You know what I mean? She's like, you're like us. I like the way that you taste. You know what I mean? You are one of us. So that's sort of the conflict point that he's been dealing with this whole time is like, yes, does he become his father, Jack Torrance, which he ends up becoming after not being strong enough to win the trauma fight with this terrible person or whatever. He becomes the sins of his father and embodies that. But I thought that was a sort of interesting way to handle it, because not only does it get him to, do the Jack Nicholson thing and hobble around with the axe, which I think is probably part of their motivation from that, but it also shows that the healing from trauma isn't linear. He failed in that moment and became but the little girl sort of forgives him for that, because I think he fucking kills himself by burning down the whole house. But he at least ends the cycle, I guess, which I don't know how I feel about that ending, to be honest with you.
Yes.
But he he at least finds a resolution and peace in himself, and he is forgiven for victimizing that little girl to the extent that he did, because she knows he didn't mean to, because he was just doing the same thing his father did and it affected him the same way. But she's going to be the one that breaks the cycle now, I guess. I don't know.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because remember how I told you about Mike Flanagan describing what he would do in the final scenes of the movie? In The Shining, the Stanley Kubrick Shining, the movie ends with basically Danny running through the maze and Jack getting lost and freezing to death and everything.
Right.
Whereas in the book, the hotel is possessing Jack Torrance. He becomes cognitive enough to tell his son that he loves him, and he proceeds to go to the boiler room and blow the Overlook Hotel up.
So that's what all the boiler room stuff is about in this movie.
Yep, so Mike Flanagan doing this is basically giving the ending Stephen King wanted, because that was one of the things that Stephen King hated, because the ultimate theme for him was about family in the first one, and he felt like, as this is a quote he said, Stanley Kubrick's film is a Cadillac without an engine and everything. Like, you have like pretty shots and everything else, but you're missing the heart of it and everything. And I think Mike saying, hey, we're going to follow a lot with Stanley Kubrick's imagery, but we're going to give you the ending that you want, which is the Overlook Hotel burning down as they accepted. So, because I guess in the book, they just fight on the grounds of the burned down hotel, because that's where it's at. So, yeah, that's what that's all about. But it was definitely weird, just sort of being like, okay, well, this is how I defeat you, is unleashing my trauma onto you. But now that trauma has gotten a hold of me and makes me want to kill Abra.
Yeah, it was interesting.
I'm kind of like, about it.
Yeah, I don't know how I feel about it either. For this whole thing being the trauma allegory, I'm trying to think of like, what is the takeaway? And at the end of the movie, whenever she's like, Dan is still with me, but as like a force ghost or whatever, because he did die that day, it's like she's happy that he finally beat the trauma, but like bittersweet because he beat it by dying, which is like, is this a pro-suicide message?
Yeah,
I don't know what's going on.
Yeah,
I don't know what, like, I don't know if it was really like his death was supposed to be as literal as it was, more like he killed that part of himself, or like I don't know exactly what the movie was going for there, which is part of the reason that holds me back from this being like, this is a great trauma allegory, because I don't know. Not that every ending, not every movie needs a perfect clean cut message at the end of like, and trauma's bad, and so go to therapy.
Yeah.
But I think that's what the movie's trying to do, just not without doing it, because she ends the movie by this girl's in a much healthier place because she decides to tell her mom that she's dealing with something.
Yeah.
She decides not to bottle it up, and she decides to talk to someone, like, which is like the allegory of like, yes, please talk to your parents or talk to a therapist if you're dealing with these problems. But which is like fine and dandy, but it's like hard to like put that bow on top of the climactic scene of like, and Ewan McGregor just self-immolated, like, and killed himself in a hotel fire because he did not win the trauma battle, I guess. Well, so I guess maybe the answer is like, life isn't that clean cut. It's not that clear. But for the movie being about Ewan McGregor trying to deal with his problems and then he ultimately lost the battle is not a very satisfying.
No, not really. I mean, I guess it's one of those weird things where they try to make it feel like a win, because ultimately I feel like that unresolved trauma, basically broke out and basically just, again, all that repression just popped back up and basically made him a monster again, except for the fact that he, that one bit where he's basically consumed and just wants to absorb anything that's bright, that's shining as it is. And she's able to see it past that because she knows who she is and that the trauma is basically personifying him at this moment. She's like, that the trauma is not you are your own person and everything, and that breaks him long enough just to say his goodbye to Abra, as then I guess ultimately acknowledges that I can't beat the trauma, and the only way I could do it is just by, again, ending the cycle, as he does blow up the boiler room. I do think they try to make it very very heavy on the symbolism and everything whenever he's there and he's just trying to face it and he feels a hand caress his face and it's his mom finally being able to look at him and he's able to look at her.
Because he's himself in that moment. He's authentically himself. He doesn't have a mask on. He's not hiding who he is. He's not hiding his shine anymore. So I think that's kind of beautiful. But yeah, I do think it's a little, I don't know, because I like it and I don't. Because I do like that it acknowledges a difficult truth and something that would be difficult to put in a movie, and yet here it is, which is that, recovery isn't linear, and sometimes even whenever you stop hitting the bottle, you stop hitting the escapism, and you actually have to confront it, that's when it's the hardest, and that he didn't win the battle. It seems like he killed himself, what I mean? Having to deal with that, but at least, he's free now, I guess, from this trauma, and, in those last moments, he was able to be himself and stop hurting other people. It's a weird mixed message for me that, it's sad that he lost the fight, but, you're supposed to believe that the cycle is broken and that this girl that he's sort of mentored that has the shine can now go out there and enter the world that they admit is still full of these people, is still full of these vampires that are going to try to hurt you, but now she seems equipped to, deal with it, I guess.
Yeah, it's definitely weird, especially because now he's sort of the Force ghost, as it was, to help guide her and everything. And she does, again, share the same message that Ian had gotten whenever he was earlier in the film at the hospice, which is they're okay. They live on and everything, and they continue on, and I guess that's sort of the shine and everything that they try to mention. And so I'm very much mixed as well, and I'm I get the ending that they're trying to go for. I just don't know how perfectly resolved that feels.
I do feel like maybe they've sacrificed some level of the message in trying to recreate that ending that was the original ending for the Shining book.
Which is I felt like overall they ended it the best they could. It's just there's a lot of choices made, a lot of inevitable road bumps that would be there and everything, but ultimately I feel like I still stand by what I said. For a sequel to Shining, this is about as good as I could have hoped for.
I would have struggled to try to write a sequel to The Shining. To be what happens now? You want me to write something that happens now?
So I definitely think it was a good idea Stephen King had. It's just, I think overall a hard thing, especially to adapt into film. So
I would agree.
I give kudos to Mike. And as for Stephen King's thoughts, whenever Mike had the movie ready and he went over to Stephen King's home in Maine, I guess Mike was so nervous. He felt like he was about to vomit and he couldn't even look at Stephen King. He was looking down at his shoes a lot after promising to adapt this film. And Stephen King gave approval for the script. He was just that's fine or whatever. But at the end of it, I guess Stephen King put a hand on Mike's shoulder and said, yep, you did good and everything. And so, and Stephen King has gone on to say that he is very happy with the adaptation of Dr. Sleep and how it was. He's he was able to take something that I intrinsically hated for a while and like it and everything. So it's actually kind of a more happy ending that a director, unlike Stanley Kubrick, as genius as he was, kind of traumatized King with his sort of adaptation of his work. And Mike just sort of acknowledged it because he was a big fan of Stephen King and Stanley Kubrick's Shining. So I do think he had a monumental task. And because trust me, whenever I say this isn't even me being like, oh, I would have done this, I would have done that. I don't know what the hell I would have done with a sequel to The Shining. I'm just like, so I feel like overall Stephen King laying the groundwork of an idea for a sequel to The Shining, as well as Mike adapting it. It's major kudos to both parties for coming up with this. Yeah. Any other thoughts or anything else like that, dude?
Man, I don't think so, bro.
I don't blame you. Definitely.
We've been too far into the thoughts already. This is a mental kind of movie.
Yes. So let's do something a little less mental, as it were. So yes, let's stupid. So this next film is going to be 10 years before Dr. Sleep film, 2009, where it stars a very popular Megan Fox.
Oh, very popular Megan Fox. Is this oh shit, it's the cult classic movie where she's like hot. Fuck, what's that movie called?
Yeah, it's a girl's name and her biggest asset.
Oh gosh, it's something. It's like Megan's Diary or whatever, but it's not that.
Yes, you're like literally. You have the same syllables.
Whenever I know, because I can like it's in my head. I just can't think of what it is. It's Jennifer's Body.
That's it. That's it.
Yeah.
Yep, that's it.
Okay.
Oh my gosh, I've never seen you be like so much like that.
My brain's like that. Like I knew where the file cabinet was, but I had to like go get it. You know.
Well, good job hitting it out of the park and everything.
Yeah.
So, yep, that's the next film we're going to watch for our podcast here. So, thank you all so much for listening to this episode. We'll see you all again next time when we're popping the scary with Jennifer's Body.
Pop that open.
Oh, no.
Oh, no.
Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube, Castbox, or iTunes platforms to stay up to date when new episodes drop. To see what Aaron and I are up to, check out our respective Twitter accounts. For me, it is @ColeKirkVA, and for Aaron, it is @AnimalGameDev. Thank you all so much for listening to our podcast. We'll speak to you all again next time when we're popping the scary.